Everyone, welcome back. Talking with Farhan Thawar, VP Engineering at Shopify, and now I want to get to actually something that introduced us in the first place, which was Trilogy software. So for those who don't know, Trilogy was an enterprise software company in Austin, Texas. Started in the early '90s, kind of had its heyday in the late '90s and early 2000s, to the point where it even got to be, I believe it was on Steve Ballmer was the one who famously said, that the only recruiting competition Microsoft had at the time was this small software company in Austin, Texas. And, I'm a case in point because coming out of college, the two offers that I came down to was Microsoft and Trilogy, and I ended up going to Trilogy. One of the things that I think Trilogy really nailed was college recruiting, right? They had a whole plan. They did everything from like going to go get the best people, then had a cycle of sending recent hires back to go talk to their peers that they knew. I'd love to hear some of your take on like what Trilogy did right or wrong with college recruiting.
Yeah, I would say the number one, this is a very salient point for me now as Shopify tries to go from 2,000 to 4,000 engineers this year, talking about recruiting. But the thing that they really made possible was that it was the number one priority in your job. Like you could basically be doing anything in the company. And if you said, oh, I have to take this interview, I have to meet this candidate, I have to do recruiting, everybody knew that took priority.
Yep.
And I think that was such a level setting for the whole company. And I don't know if this was your experience, but from my experience, I didn't work Fridays like on software. Yep. I spent every Friday for 3 years that I was at Trilogy interviewing, talking to candidates, going to lunches, meeting with them, taking them to dinner after. Like that was every Friday all the time. There was never a thing, even if my manager liked it or didn't like it, that they could do because it was a company level priority. So I think the thing they did right was they gave permission to let everybody know, hey, look, this is part of your job. And it's not only part of your job, it is the most important thing. You can stop the other thing you're doing, whatever it is, and focus on recruiting if recruiting is a priority. So that was the first thing that they did super well. And that is something that I've taken to my whole career. I've always prioritized recruiting.
I'm with you on that, which is that, at the end of the day, what is a company but the people, right? And, one of the main reasons I went to the Zebra was to be able to go build a team of people that I wanted to work with that challenged me, that were, made me better, that I could make better. And so it all comes down to people, and you're not going to get the great people if you don't invest in getting them and growing them, right? And I think that actually also speaks to one of the things that Trilogy, what was unique, it was intense, but did really well, which was Trilogy University, or TU for short, which was, this was a time where, no hyperbole, we did work 100 hours a week. I think I literally went home for a few hours to sleep, but I ate all my meals there. I worked, we had beanbags, we had everything, but we didn't just come in and get this slow introduction to the company and, a little project. We were put right on to do this work, learn this, hardcore technical courses from the best technical people, business courses, and it was almost like an MBA in like 3 months.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Trilogy University was also a place where there was such bonding going on that they ended up being like lifetime bonds. If you read, I think Google recently came out with an article called Google's Quest to Build the Perfect Team. And if you look at the things they figured out, they were all figured out by Trilogy 20 years ago.
Yep.
Right? It said have a personal bond with people, talk about your own life and experiences. And we had that SEE approach, which was like shared emotional experience. Yep. And there was something about the culture of intensity and smart people that really shaped us. Actually, there's a really good HBR article called Career Imprinting, which talks about how the first job you get out of school imprints you for the rest of your working career. And you can definitely tell when you meet Trilogy people that there's something different.
Just yesterday, you tweeted this Venn diagram of things that I learned at other companies and things that I learned at Shopify, right? And so I'd love to kind of learn more about that. Like what has been so unique about Shopify compared to your previous work experiences?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because what I found is that Shopify really does try to take a first principles approach to everything. and not really care what anybody else does. Like it's very, we always say this to people, right? Hey, don't care about what people think about you. And, but it's really hard to do in practice, right? If, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Twitter, Square, Stripe are doing something one way, then you look at it and say, those seem to be good engineering cultures. We should just copy it. And what's amazing about Shopify is like, we mostly like try to learn as much as we can, like anybody, but very rarely are we're just looking at it going, now, what do we think we should do at Shopify based on the things we've learned? And a lot of times it's completely different. Like it's very strange to me because like in a good way that we will just try something different. I mean, well, here's one good example, right? A lot of the industry has moved towards like microservices, right? We have a giant monolith, right? The Ruby and Ruby on Rails kind of fell out of favor. We build our whole stack on it and we're core contributors, right? I'm in mobile. I was building apps for many amazing companies and we were always building native. Shopify's doing React Native, right? So like we don't try to look and see what everybody else is doing. We try to look at other things. And we say, for instance, what's the technology curve? Where's it going? What are we going to do? How do we get engineering leverage? How do we make sure we build the right thing for our merchants? And that because it's so aligned with the mission, they end up being different questions and answers. And I think that it's refreshing. I mean, here, I'll give you another example. When we have our yearly kickoff, we have a thing called Shopify Summit. I've been to many of these in many companies, right? From Microsoft, like Trilogy, we had kickoffs. And they're very tactical, right? We talk about the products we're going to launch and what we did last year and like whatever. And at Shopify, we talk about like philosophy and like, how do we make sure we don't end up in a local maximum? Like it's very like self-actualizing. Like you think about your own life and you say, am I working on the most important thing I can be working on in my life? And it's refreshing and it's very different.
That's awesome. Do you think that a lot of that was born out of the foundations of the company and where it came from?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely comes from like Toby's a very philosophical person, but it's also that he's not trying to do things to be popular, right? So when Ruby on Rails came out, right, he was a core contributor. It was like 04 or 06, like super early. And everybody said, there's no way you could ever build any scalable system on this thing. And his approach was not, well, Ruby's this thing and I'm making a bet. Instead, he's like, how do I make sure that it's not risky? I'm just going to fix Ruby or I'm going to fix Rails. Like that's our approach, right? So when I wrote this blog post last year about using React Native for mobile, it wasn't that I made a risk analysis and said, okay, I don't think it's that risky, or maybe a few years from now, it might be the wrong decision. Instead, I look at it and say, how do I run head on to this risk? So what did I do? I hired core contributors. I run the working group. I'm with Facebook every month, right? I'm making the platform better. That's how I reduce the risk.
That's awesome. I love that way of looking at it, of like, it's not completely out of your hands, right? Like you can reduce the risk by actually taking it more. It's almost the whole like, keep your friends
close.
Keep your enemies close.
But I mean, like I'm doing like a bear hug around React Native, right? So instead of like saying it's that thing over there that just happens to be a framework we use, I'm like, how do I affect the framework? How do I sponsored a company to like have 4 engineers work on open source.
That's awesome. Well, I want to the last thing I want to get into is one thing you mentioned around monolith versus microservices, because that's been big recently. Of like we swung one way over like to microservices from like just monolith SOA to microservices, and now like coming back. And I read an article a couple of years ago that talked about how silos actually aren't bad, right? Silos themselves are meant for efficiency. Their efficiency of communication and work. It's that the silos need to be appropriately designed so that the majority of the work you do is within the silos, right? And that you keep the cross-silo communication, which has to happen to a minimum. And so, that also then speaks to organization design and repo design and things like that. And so how do you find that working in a monolith kind of allows you to have independent teams or not, like working in different areas? How do you get that, right? Because that's one cross silo communication mechanism that you have to, contend with there.
You brought up a very good point, because we're a monolithic code base, but we were not a monolithic company. We used to have like product lines, and that was actually a cause for it was good for our evolution at that point. But very recently we made a pretty big org change to make the company more monolithic, like our code base. And that actually solved a lot of the problems. And the way we attack that is like when you think of microservices, typically you have teams that try to own the end-to-end stack. And while there might be some efficiencies here or there, you really can own the end-to-end experience all the way to from like, view to persistence.
Right.
And what we say instead is we say, you know what, because we're a monolith, we might have over 1,000 engineers in like one repo. We will actually instead have a team called developer acceleration to make everybody more effective. So instead what we do is we say, hey, we're going to build these shared services. We're going to try to go from N to one. You shouldn't have N ways to do something. You should have one way to do something. And where you put your code is just as important as the code you're writing. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure that we are leveling everybody up by all the things that we do. And that allows us to do something quite different, which is like in your mind, like the silo idea is to make sure that you're efficient in the things that you're doing. So we're efficient because we have people making the foundations efficient, people who are focused on the CI and CD, our test infrastructure, scalability, we have prod eng. But the other thing we do is we try to minimize code ownership. We try to say like, look, I know that team over there is the one responsible for writing most of the code, but you can go write code in there. They'll review your PR, but you don't like, you reduce the weighting in these types of environments by not saying like, oh, if it's not on your roadmap, people are like, I got to wait for that team. Instead, you're like, no, you can do it. They'll PR it and the PR review it, and then you can get out. So that's how we kind of get out of this like waiting game of like that team. And then it also gets us out of like having to build all that infrastructure ourselves.
So that's, not to get like super tactical in the weeds, but how do you handle things like merge conflicts, right? Because one of the things with everyone working in a monolith is you have lots of code, especially when you have 1,000 engineers that could touch the same thing, right? Which means that all of a sudden you get to potential merge conflicts. And because people are working in different areas, they might not have the context to appropriately resolve them.
Yeah, so we have a blog post about this, I'm pretty sure, how to merge like thousands of developers of code. There's a bunch of different things we do. One is we have quite an interesting way to merge, where we have like a probabilistic, like we actually have like a Monte Carlo algorithm that merges things in different orders and then runs automated tests to figure out what's the build that has the most likelihood of passing these tests. So we do things like that, and your merge might not get in which case you can try to remerge. So there's a bunch of these like techniques that we've learned over time that will allow us to like have a merge queue, figure out which merge should go in what order, deploy to production, run automated tests. And we're also big fans of like production. The only thing that's production is production. And so while we have automated tests and everything, we know some things are only available to be tested in the environment that they're going to be running on. And so we have amazing systems to like auto rollback if things are not looking well. And that allows engineers to be effective because they're deploying, and then they know when something's going in the merge queue to kind of watch to see the dashboards to see if anything wrong is happening. Test pass, it's good. Now you can go back to coding. So we have a bunch of techniques to do that, but it's because we have people working on infra that let us not have to focus on that end-to-end view that maybe a microservices team has to.
Yep. Which is interesting because you've taken the focus of an infra team, which might be on a service mesh and on observability and other things in a more microservices world, and put them on a different problem. Right?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, and then we do like, to be fair, we have monoliths, right? We have like 5 or 6, but the idea is that in most microservices environments that I've seen, you try to make it easy to have a service, and we try to make it super hard. Like it's possible, but we want to make it hard because we're like, in theory, you should try to figure out where your code can go in the existing infrastructure. And then only in extreme cases should you be building something new.
That's awesome. And so the last question I have around that is around ramp up time, right? Which is, one of the things about a monolith is that the amount of time it takes to go and understand and comprehend everything gets bigger and bigger, and you get to a point where one person can't understand all of it. So how do you get around that?
Yeah, for us, like it isn't true. It is probably not true that any one person can understand all of Shopify. Like there's enough going on. That's probably true of any company. You can't understand everything, but it's still modular, right? There's still modularization happening. It's just that we try to get rid of the network boundaries that you have to cross and orchestration. Like those things don't happen as much because you're still in that same code base. So yes, of course, it's still modular and you can figure out and learn about your area. You can also, like I mentioned, go and touch someone else's area via PR review. But there's, of course, like in any company, onboarding and things to help you understand the area you're onboarding into. And then you can learn more of the system over time.
Great. Well, thanks for the chat, Farhan. It's been great to catch up. Hopefully you got your cookies in while I had my beer here.
I'll finish it after this.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciated the conversation, and I will catch you all next time on Tesh on Tap.